Welcome back to Daily Horror. Tonight's stories are not about simple ghosts in the dark. They're about something colder than that. The fear of realizing there is nowhere to escape. No clean exit, no safe procedure, no department door that stays locked against whatever is already inside. These are the kinds of accounts that begin in fluorescent light and paper trails, in evidence rooms, welfare checks, traffic stops, interrogation rooms, basements beneath stations where the air turns stale and the silence starts to feel intentional. And before we go any further, let me be clear. These are not urban legends, and they're not internet fiction dressed up as fact. They come from real witness accounts, cross-checked against records, reports, and the kind of details that don't survive if someone is lying carelessly. The people telling these stories are police officers, deputies, detectives, clerks, and troopers who lived through something they still don't know how to explain. Whatever followed them home, it didn't begin with a scream. It began with duty. If you want to keep seeing more unexplained files, more sealed reports, and more stories that should have stayed buried, subscribe now and stay close. And if you've ever worked in law enforcement, or just know what it feels like to be trapped by a system that won't admit what it's protecting, leave a comment and tell us where that line between the ordinary and the impossible started to break for you. Now, turn the lights down and listen carefully, because the first story begins with a routine evidence inventory in a county basement that should have been empty. The first time I heard something breathing under the floor, I froze so hard I couldn't even call for help. Ever since that night, I've avoided basements like they're cursed. 3 years have passed since I left the department, but I still can't stand at the top of a stairwell and look down into one of those dark, concrete mouths without feeling my skin tighten. Back then, I worked in a city department building that was old enough to have stories attached to it. Everyone knew the place had a basement, but nobody liked talking about it for long. Officially, it was just storage, unused furniture, broken filing cabinets, boxes of archived records, old cleaning supplies. That was the harmless version. The truth was, the basement had a way of unsettling people. Lights down there flickered even after the bulbs were replaced. Cold air drifted up through the vents in the middle of summer. People said they heard footsteps when they were alone on the first floor. Some claimed they caught movement at the bottom of the stairwell, just beyond the reach of the light. Most of us laughed about it during lunch, because that's what people do when they are scared and don't want to admit it. I laughed too. Right up until the week I was assigned to inventory old records in the basement archives. At first, it seemed like an easy task. 2 days, maybe 3. Nothing glamorous, but nothing dangerous either. I was given a clipboard, a flashlight, and a ring of keys that looked like they'd been dragged through 10 different decades. The elevator didn't go down that far, so I had to use the service stairs. The stairwell smelled like damp concrete, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old pennies left in rainwater. The first descent was bad enough. The second was worse. The basement was huge, much larger than it should have been. The ceiling was low, pipes ran overhead like exposed veins, and rows of metal shelving disappeared into shadow. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly buzz. In some corners, the light didn't seem to reach the walls at all. Boxes were stacked in rough columns, and every sound I made seemed to come back delayed, as if something else were echoing after me. I spent the first afternoon moving through file rows, checking labels, marking box numbers. It was boring work, the kind that makes your mind drift. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed that the temperature near the far end of the room had dropped sharply. My breath wasn't visible, but the air felt colder there, almost wet. I assumed it was a broken pipe or a vent issue and kept working. That was when I heard the first noise. It sounded like a soft drag across concrete. I looked up, expecting maybe a maintenance cart, a loose cable, something ordinary. Nothing. The aisles were empty. The fluorescent tubes overhead kept buzzing. Then came another sound, slower this time, like a fingernail tapping once on metal. Tap. A pause. Tap. I remember laughing nervously and saying, "Hello?" No answer. I told myself the building was old and settling. Wood shifted. Pipes clanged. Rats lived in basements. That explanation lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard it again, but closer. This time it came from behind the shelving unit at the end of the row. Not movement, not quite. More like someone standing very still and breathing through their nose. I walked toward the sound with the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I reached the end of the aisle, I swept the beam across the floor, the shelves, the wall, and finally into the narrow gap behind the storage racks. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. But the air behind the shelves was colder than anywhere else in the room, so cold it felt wrong, like opening a freezer full of stagnant water. I stood there for a second too long, trying to make sense of it, and then the overhead light above me flickered violently. In that split second of darkness, I heard something whisper my name, very softly, right next to my ear. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. No one was there. The room behind me was empty, rows of boxes stretching into shadow. My mouth had gone dry. I checked the hallway outside the archive room, then the stairwell, then the far corners of the basement. Still nothing. I ended up convincing myself that I was tired, or stressed, or imagining things because I'd spent too long underground. I did not go back to the office and tell anyone that I'd just heard my own name whispered in an empty basement. I didn't want to be the guy everyone quietly stopped inviting to lunch. So I kept working. That was a mistake. Over the next few days, the little signs started piling up. A box I had placed on one shelf would be found on the floor the next morning. A door at the far end of the basement that should have been locked would stand slightly open. Once, I came down and found muddy footprints crossing the concrete floor. They weren't mine. I had clean shoes, and the prints were too long, too narrow, and spaced in a way that felt unnatural, like someone had walked on tiptoe for an unreasonably long distance. I reported the broken latch on the door. I mentioned the drafty cold spot. I did not mention the whispering. I also didn't mention that the footprints stopped right in front of the archive room and then vanished. A couple of coworkers joked that I was turning into one of those people who sees ghosts in every hallway. I laughed along, because if I didn't, I might have admitted I was starting to believe them. Then came the night I stayed late. I had fallen behind on the inventory, and the department building was nearly empty by the time I realized how late it had gotten. The upper floors were quiet, and the basement was quieter in a way that made it worse. The lights were still on down there, but the darkness between them seemed deeper than before. I remember standing at the bottom of the stairs, listening to the building settle around me. Then I heard something moving deeper in the archive room, slowly, deliberately. Not a rat, not a pipe, not a random sound, something walking. I should have left. I know that now. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the aisle where the noise had come from. My own footsteps sounded too loud, too confident, like they belonged to someone who wasn't scared. The shelves cast long shadows across the floor, and every step seemed to pull more darkness toward me. At the far end of the room, the sound stopped. I stopped too. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt. Then the flashlight beam caught something pale between two shelves. At first I thought it was a torn file folder or a piece of paper stuck to the metal. But it moved. It moved the wrong way, sliding back behind the shelf, as if whatever I'd seen had been standing there just long enough to let me notice. My stomach dropped. I backed up one step, then another. The beam trembled across the floor, the boxes, the lower shelf edges. I told myself not to panic, that maybe someone was in the basement playing a prank, though even as the thought formed, I knew it was nonsense. There was nowhere for a person to hide back there. The shelves were against the wall. Then I heard breathing, not from the aisle, not from behind me, from inside the wall. A slow, damp exhale came through the concrete so close I could feel it in my teeth. The air in front of me seemed to thicken. I remember smelling soil, wet stone, and something sweeter, like rot hidden under perfume. I turned and ran. I didn't care how ridiculous I must have looked, stumbling down the aisle with the flashlight bouncing wildly across the shelves. Behind me, I heard the sound of something moving fast, too fast, scraping against concrete with a wet, dragging rhythm that had no business being human. I hit the stairwell door so hard my shoulder nearly dislocated. I clawed at the handle, fumbled with the lock, and burst through just as something struck the other side with enough force to rattle the metal frame. I never looked back. I made it to the upper floor and called security with shaking hands, telling them I thought someone might have broken into the basement. 2 guards and a supervisor checked the area. They found the archive room empty, no signs of forced entry, no intruder, no damage, except for one thing. The far wall of the archive room was damp, as if water had seeped through from the other side. The next morning, I was back in the basement with them, because I had to finish the inventory and because nobody wanted to officially admit there was a problem. That was when the real terror started. The boxes I'd left neatly labeled were scattered across the floor. Several file cabinets had been opened and emptied. Papers were soaked, not with water exactly, but with something gray and slick that smelled like earth after rain. One of the guards pointed to a patch of dust near the back wall. There were footprints again, but this time, they weren't leading into the archive room. They were coming out of the wall. I'm not proud of what I did next, but fear strips dignity away fast. I asked to see the maintenance plans. I checked the old building records. I talked to a retired employee who had worked there for decades. The kind of man who remembers everything because he has nothing to gain by lying. He got very quiet when I asked about the basement. Then he told me that the building hadn't always stood the way it did now. Before the current foundation was poured, there had been another structure on the same land, much older, smaller. The records were vague, but the history wasn't hard to piece together. There had been a collapse below ground years ago during a renovation long before I was hired. One worker had disappeared in the incident. They never found the body. The official report blamed structural failure and closed it up quickly, but the old man looked at me with a face that had gone pale under his weathered skin and said, "That basement was sealed, but not everything in there stayed buried." I tried to laugh. It came out thin and useless. He told me there are places where a wall is only a wall for the living. I didn't go back to the basement after that conversation unless I absolutely had to, and even then I refused to enter alone. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. Maybe I hoped that avoiding the place would make whatever was down there lose interest. It didn't. The whispers started appearing in other parts of the building, in the hallway outside my office, in the restroom with the broken. Once, while riding the elevator, I heard my name spoken from beneath the floor panel. I began sleeping badly. I kept waking up with the sense that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, breathing quietly in the dark. Then one evening, as I was locking up my desk, I found a sheet of paper tucked under the keyboard. It was one of the inventory forms I had used in the basement. Across the bottom, in shaky pencil marks, were 3 words: "You left me here." I dropped the paper and backed away so fast my chair hit the wall. I quit not long after that. I gave no formal explanation. I said I had personal reasons, family issues, the usual vague nonsense people use when they don't want to tell the truth. But the truth was simple. I would rather have left my job, my reputation, and half my savings behind than spend one more day wondering what was waiting beneath that building. Even now, years later, I still catch myself reacting when I pass an open stairwell or hear a low rumble under a floorboard. Sometimes, in old buildings, I swear I smell that same wet concrete and soil smell, and my chest tightens like it's trying to warn me before my brain can catch up. I've told this story carefully because I know how it sounds. I know how easy it is to dismiss fear as imagination, to explain away every strange noise and cold draft. I used to think that way too, but there's one thing I never forget. On my last day there, after I handed in my badge and cleared out my desk, I looked back toward the basement door one final time. The corridor was empty. The lights were on. Everything looked normal enough to fool anyone who hadn't been down there. Then, from somewhere below the floor, I heard a slow, patient knock. Not a random bang, not a pipe, 3 measured taps, then a familiar whisper, carried up through the cracks in the concrete like a breath from underground. My name. And after that, something else. Something I still haven't told anyone. Because if I say it out loud, I have a terrible feeling it might answer back. The dispatch call sounded ordinary enough, a welfare check on an elderly woman who hadn't been seen for 6 weeks. Nothing dramatic, nothing strange, just another lonely house on a quiet street where neighbors noticed the mail stacking up and finally decided to call it in. I remember pulling up to that place thinking I'd be in and out within 10 minutes. If I had known what was waiting behind that door, I would have driven right past and never looked back. The house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with dead-looking hedges and sagging fences. The paint on the siding had peeled in long curling strips, and the front steps were cracked and leaning to one side like they'd been neglected for years. The yard was overgrown in that unnatural way grass gets when no one has touched it in a long time. It wasn't just messy, it felt abandoned, but not in the normal sense, more like the place had been deliberately left alone. I parked, stepped out, and noticed how quiet it was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, either. It was the kind that presses in on your ears, like the whole street is holding its breath. No dogs barking, no wind in the trees. Even the distant traffic sounded muffled, as if the house were sitting inside a bubble. The front windows were dirty, but I could still make out shapes moving inside. I stopped walking. At first, I told myself it was just reflections, my own shadow, the branches shifting behind me. But then one of those shapes moved again, slow and uncertain, like someone pacing just behind the glass. I radioed in the address and said I was making contact with the resident. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I knocked once, then twice. Nothing. The porch light flickered overhead, even though it was broad daylight. I knocked harder and called out, "Police! Ma'am, I'm here to check on you. If you're inside, please come to the door." For a moment, there was no sound. Then I heard it, a dragging noise. Slow, heavy, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I asked again if anyone was there, and this time a voice answered from inside, so faint I almost missed it. "Don't open it." That was enough to raise the hair on my arms. I leaned closer to the door and said, "Ma'am, if you're in there, I need you to come to the door and speak to me." Another pause. Then the voice returned, even quieter this time. "It isn't me at the door." My first thought was confusion. My second was that the woman might be disoriented, sick, maybe suffering from dementia. That happens. A lot. But the way she said it, flat and terrified, made my stomach tighten. I tried the knob. It was locked. I could hear movement now, not just one set of footsteps. Several. Uneven, shuffling sounds from different parts of the house, as if more than one person was wandering around inside with no clear idea where they were going. I backed away from the door and peered through the side window near the porch. The curtains were half drawn. Inside, the room looked wrong somehow, too dim despite the daylight outside. Furniture sat under sheets like it had been covered for months. On the far wall, I saw photographs lined up in neat rows, all of them with the faces scratched out. Then I noticed something else. A hand was pressed against the other side of the front door. Not just resting there, pushing. The wood bowed inward with a soft creak, and I took another step back. "Ma'am?" I said, but my voice was already changing. "Who else is in the house?" The answer came from somewhere behind the door, and it was no longer the elderly woman's voice. "It knows you're here now." The hand vanished. I should have left immediately. That would have been the smart thing. Call for backup, wait outside, do it by the book. But there was something about that house that made every instinct in me feel tangled up. Maybe it was concern. Maybe it was the strange guilt that creeps in when someone vulnerable may be trapped inside. So I did what I still regret most. I forced the door open. The smell hit me first. Rot, stale air. Something metallic underneath it, sharp and wet, like old blood. The front hallway was dark even with the door open. The air inside felt colder than outside, and the silence had a thick, suffocating quality. I stepped in slowly, one hand near my weapon, flashlight cutting across the walls. That was when I saw the scuff marks on the floor. Dozens of them, dragging lines, smeared footprints, and deep grooves in the wood, as if something had been pulled through the hallway over and over again. On the wall beside the coat rack, there were scratches so deep they'd ripped through the paint and into the plaster. I called out again, louder this time, but no one answered. A framed mirror hung crooked in the hall, its glass clouded with age. For a split second, I saw my reflection in it. Then, just behind me, another shape appeared. I whipped around. Nothing there. When I looked back at the mirror, the second figure was gone. but now my own reflection was standing a little too still, staring at me with a delay, like it was thinking before copying me. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself I was tired, that the heat, the silence, the stress of the call were messing with me. So I kept moving. The living room was to the left. The kitchen was straight ahead. Both were dark, both wrong in ways I couldn't name right away. In the living room, there were more photographs. Family pictures, I think, though it was hard to tell because every face had been damaged. Some were scratched out. Some were burned. One had been stabbed through the center with something sharp enough to leave a hole clean through the frame and wall behind it. The furniture looked untouched for years, but there were fresh tracks in the dust, thin lines crossing the carpet in circles around the room. Then I heard it again, that dragging sound. This time it came from the hallway behind me. I turned so fast my flashlight beam shook across the walls. At the far end of the corridor, something had just slipped around the corner. I only caught a glimpse, pale skin, too thin, and a shape that seemed bent in the wrong direction. "Hey!" I shouted, drawing my weapon. "Police! Stop!" No response. I moved forward carefully, each step louder than the last, and the house seemed to react to me. Floorboards creaked under my boots, even where they should have been solid. Something tapped once against the inside of a wall, then another tap, then a rapid little rhythm, as if fingernails were drumming from inside the plaster. I reached the end of the hall and found 3 doors. One was a bathroom, one a bedroom. The last was shut tight and covered in old brass charms, twisted string, and strips of faded cloth tied around the knob like someone had tried to seal it from the outside. The bedroom door was open a crack. I pushed it wider. The room was cramped and stale, the bed stripped bare except for a thin gray blanket. An oxygen machine sat in one corner, unplugged and coated in dust. On the nightstand were pill bottles, all opened and empty, and a glass of cloudy water with something dark settled at the bottom. And in the bed, under the blanket, there was a shape. My heart pounded. I crossed the room and pulled the blanket back. It was just a pillow, but the pillow had been arranged to look like a body, with a nightgown laid over it and gray hair pinned around the top like a wig. I stepped back, furious now, more scared than I wanted to admit. "Mrs. Langford," I called, reading the name off the mail I'd seen outside. "If you're here, answer me." A whisper came from the closet. I froze. The whisper came again, dry and broken, like air moving through a throat that hadn't been used in days. I pulled open the closet door. Inside, crouched in the dark, was the elderly woman. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was waxy and pale, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She looked starved and exhausted, like she had been hiding there for weeks. One hand clutched a rosary so tightly the beads had cut into her palm. She stared at me with raw panic and put a finger to her lips. "Don't let it hear you," she whispered. Then I heard a sound from the room behind me, not the woman's voice, not mine. Something was speaking in a low, wet murmur, repeating words I couldn't make out. I turned, weapon up, and saw the bed. The pillow shape was gone. In its place sat a figure I had not seen before, hunched and still under the blanket, its head turned toward me at an impossible angle. Slowly, the blanket began to slide down. I backed toward the closet, my flashlight locked on whatever was in the bed, and I saw the thing's face. It looked almost human, if you only glanced at it for a second. But the more I stared, the more wrong it became. The skin was stretched tight across the cheekbones. The eyes were too dark and too deep. The mouth was full of teeth that didn't match, as though they'd been collected from different mouths and jammed together in a hurry. And when it smiled, the corners of its lips split a little farther than any human face should have allowed. The woman made a sound behind me, a tiny, terrified gasp. The thing in the bed tilted its head toward her. "You kept me waiting," it said, but the voice was no longer its own. It sounded like several voices layered together, old and young at once, male and female, all speaking through the same throat. I had my weapon trained on it, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the sight lined up. "What is this?" I shouted, though I already knew I didn't want the answer. The elderly woman began to cry, silent tears sliding down her cheeks. "It came in after my husband died," she said, At first it only stood in the hall at night. Then it started speaking like him. Then like my daughter. Then it wouldn't leave. My mouth went dry. Why didn't you call sooner? She laughed once. A cracked, miserable sound. We did. That's when I understood the photos on the walls, the scratched out faces, the sealed bedroom, the pillow in the bed. This wasn't a house with one missing woman. This was a house that had been slowly swallowed by something that wore people the way a child wears costume. The thing in the bed unfolded itself with a creak of joints that sounded too many and too few at the same time. It stood, and I swear the room got smaller around it. It looked at me, then at the old woman, then back at me. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it whispered. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I only remember the flash, the blast, and the thing jerking backward into the wall. The mirror in the hall shattered all at once, though I never touched it. The lights, though none were on, seemed to pulse once in the dark. I grabbed the woman by the arm and pulled her toward me. She was light as paper. We ran for the front door while something moved behind us. Fast now, scraping along the floor and walls in a way that made my stomach turn. At the threshold, I looked back. The hallway was full of figures. Not fully formed, not entirely solid, but enough to make my blood run cold. Shapes standing in the dark, faces I couldn't quite recognize. Some looked like the same person in different stages of decay. One had a child's frame. Another moved with the stiff, broken pace of an old man. All of them were staring at me with the same dead patience. The elderly woman sobbed beside me, whispering prayers under her breath. Then the thing in the bed spoke again from somewhere behind them all. "Come back when you're alone." I got us out. I got her into the car. I drove until my hands stopped shaking enough to keep the vehicle in the lane. By the time backup arrived, the house looked empty from the outside, almost peaceful. But nobody wanted to go back in. Not after hearing what I had to say. Not after seeing the woman. She never gave a clear statement. Not one that made sense, anyway. She kept saying the same thing over and over. It learned the house from the people who died in it. I put in my report. They sent people. They found the empty rooms, the broken mirror, the scratched faces, the sealed bedroom, the old woman's medications, and nothing else. No body. No trace of an intruder. No sign of forced entry. Nothing that explained the voices, the figures, or the thing I saw standing in that bed. The woman was taken somewhere safe, or so they told me. I never saw her again. As for me, I still think about that front door. I think about the hand pressing against it from the inside. I think about the voice telling me not to open it. And most of all, I think about the moment I saw my own reflection lag behind me in that dirty hallway mirror, like something inside the glass had started learning how to be human. Because ever since that night, sometimes when I pass by a mirror in my own house, I get the feeling I'm not the first one to look back. The dashcam in my patrol car captured events that should have been impossible. And if I can't get someone to believe me soon, I know exactly how this ends. It started on an ordinary night that should have faded from memory by morning. The streets were nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel too loud, and my cruiser rolled through the dark like it had done 1,000 times before. I remember being tired, half listening to the radio, and watching the same cracked sidewalks and dim porch lights pass by in a slow, sleepy blur. Nothing about that shift felt unusual at first. No sirens, no urgent calls, no reason to expect that my life was about to go completely wrong. Then the first thing happened that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it. A car appeared behind me on an empty road. I saw its headlights in the mirror, bright and steady, closing the distance way too fast. I checked the time, checked the road, and even glanced at the dashcam screen out of habit. There was no record of it yet, just black glass reflecting my own face. I eased off the accelerator, expecting the driver to pass or at least slow down. It didn't. The vehicle stayed back for a few seconds, then disappeared so suddenly it was like it had never been there at all. No turn, no alley, no side street. Just one moment it was following me, and the next moment the road behind me was empty again. I actually laughed under my breath, because I thought exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But then I looked at the dashcam footage later, and the laugh died in my throat, The footage showed a car that never passed by the patrol unit. It wasn't just missing from the mirror, it wasn't there at all. Yet on the video, I can clearly see headlights behind me, and I can clearly see a shape moving in the distance as though something had been tailing me for miles. The strange part is that every time I rewind that section, the car looks a little different. Same position, same road, same terrifying presence, but the details shift, the color changes, the outline blurs. Once, for just a split second, it looked like the windshield was full of faces. I should have stopped right there and reported it. I know that now. But I didn't. I told myself I was tired, told myself the camera must be glitching, told myself there had to be some simple explanation if I just kept moving. So I kept driving. About 20 minutes later, I got a call to check on an abandoned house just outside town. No lights, no registered occupants, and a neighbor had reported hearing banging from inside. That kind of call usually means a raccoon, a broken pipe, or teenagers trying to scare each other. Nothing worth worrying about. I pulled up to the property, got out, and felt that immediate wrongness that sometimes hangs in the air before a bad scene. The house sat alone in a patch of dead grass, its windows dark and hollow, the front porch sagging like it had been holding its breath for years. The door was unlocked. That should have bothered me more than it did. Instead, I stepped in with my flashlight raised and called out. No answer. The beam cut across peeling wallpaper, a tipped-over chair, and a hallway that seemed to stretch farther than the outside of the house should have allowed. The air inside was cold enough to sting my skin. I remember hearing something move upstairs, slow and deliberate, like bare feet dragging across wood. I climbed the stairs with my hand resting near my holster, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake. At the top, I found a bedroom with the door half open and a child's toy sitting in the middle of the floor. It was one of those old plastic animals that makes a faint clicking noise when you roll it. Except it wasn't rolling. It was rocking back and forth by itself, tapping against the floorboards in a soft, steady rhythm. Then, from the far corner of the room, someone whispered my name. Not shouted, not spoken, whispered, close enough that I could feel breath near my ear, even though I was alone. I turned so fast I nearly slipped. There was nobody there. My flashlight beam swept the walls, the cracked mirror, the empty closet, the bed with its twisted sheets. And then I saw something that made me back away so hard I hit the doorway. In the mirror, standing behind me, was a figure that did not match my reflection. It was tall and wrong in a way I can't properly explain, with its head bent slightly to one side like it was listening. The face looked almost human, but only almost. The eyes were too dark, the mouth too wide, and the smile was not a smile at all. It was the expression of something trying to remember how people look when they're friendly. I spun around again. Nothing. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, and now it was closer. I ran. I did not stay professional. I did not clear the room. I did not secure the house. I hit the stairs so hard I nearly fell, and I burst back into the night with my pulse hammering in my throat. I got into the patrol car and locked the doors, breathing like I'd just escaped a fire. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I noticed the back seat. There was someone sitting there. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. But I saw him in the rearview mirror, hunched in the shadows behind me. His face turned toward the window. I froze so completely I could hear the engine humming and my own blood rushing in my ears. Slowly, I looked over my shoulder. The back seat was empty. I looked back at the mirror. He was still there. This time, he raised one hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. The print it left was pale and wet, like the hand had just come out of a river. I shouted, slammed the cruiser into gear, and drove away from that house with no idea where I was going. My radio crackled with static. Then, through the noise, I heard another voice mixed in with it. Not dispatch, not another officer. A whisper, low and intimate, as if someone had leaned close to the mic and started speaking directly into my ear. It said, "You saw me." I nearly crashed the car. I should have called for backup immediately. Instead, I made the worst decision of my life and headed back toward the station. Because if I'm being honest, I think I wanted witnesses. I wanted other people around me. I wanted bright lights, locked doors, and familiar faces. I wanted anything that would convince me this was just stress and lack of sleep. But the closer I got to town, the more wrong everything became. The streets were empty in a way they shouldn't have been. No pedestrians, no traffic, no movement in any windows. Even the traffic lights seemed dimmer, like they were struggling to stay alive. The station building stood ahead of me, but something about it looked off. The windows were dark. The parking lot was empty. The American flag out front hung motionless, though there was wind everywhere else. I parked, got out, and walked toward the entrance with my flashlight trembling in my hand. The front doors were unlocked. Inside, the lobby was silent. Too silent. My footsteps sounded muffled, as if I were walking through deep carpet even though the floor was tile. Desk chairs were tipped over. Papers had been scattered across the counter, but not by a breeze. It looked more like someone had rushed out in a panic and never come back. I called out for my sergeant, then for dispatch, then for anybody. No answer. At the far end of the hallway, I saw a light flicker on and off inside the briefing room. Fallout's the best some of the most. I remember hearing my own voice echo somewhere down the corridor, except I had stopped speaking. That was the moment I realized something horrifying. The building had my sound in it, but not me. The place was replaying me, like an old tape stuck on the wrong track. I moved toward the briefing room anyway, because by then fear had become so heavy it felt almost impossible to stop. The door stood open just a crack. Inside, every chair was facing the screen at the front of the room. On that screen was the live feed from my Dashcam. I was looking at myself from the street outside the station. Except in the video, I was not alone. There were several figures standing behind the cruiser, all of them just outside the reach of the headlights. They didn't move like normal people. They shifted in tiny, broken motions, too quick in one instant and perfectly still the next. One of them leaned down until its face was right at the rear passenger window. Even through the grainy footage, I could see the outline of a grin stretching across it. And then, on the video, I saw myself climb out of the cruiser. I know that makes no sense. I was standing in the hallway, staring at the screen. My body was right there. But on the recording, another me opened the driver's door and stepped into the dark parking lot, as if something had peeled me out of time and left only the shell behind. The version of me on the screen slowly turned toward the figures in the lot. He raised one hand, almost like he was greeting them. He smiled. I don't remember smiling. I stumbled back, and the briefing room door swung shut behind me with a hard, final click. The lights went out. In the dark, something brushed past my shoulder. I swung my flashlight around wildly, and for one bright instant I saw faces all around me in the black glass of the framed certificates on the wall. Not reflections, faces watching from inside the frames, pale and patient and hungry. I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, many footsteps. Then I heard my own voice again, coming from somewhere farther down the station. It was calm, too calm. Don't let it in. I'm writing this because I found the Dashcam file, and I can't unsee what's inside it. The footage keeps changing every time I play it. Sometimes I'm alone. Sometimes there's someone in the back seat. Sometimes the house is empty. And sometimes there are things standing in the doorway that look like they're waiting for permission. Once, for less than a second, the camera showed the station lobby full of officers I know for a fact were never on duty that night. They were all staring at me. I have tried deleting the file. It keeps coming back. I have tried turning off the system. The screen turns on by itself. I have tried leaving town. Twice. Each time I end up back near the same road, with the same headlights behind me, getting closer. If you are reading this, then maybe the file made it out somehow. Maybe someone else can see what I'm seeing. Maybe someone can explain why the same figure keeps appearing in every recording, always just outside the light, always one step behind me, always with that terrible, patient smile. Because tonight I checked the patrol car one last time, and the driver's seat was warm. I was not in it, and the Dashcam was still recording. The first body I found was already gone. That was the part that kept me awake for nights afterward, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house creak around me like it was breathing. Most people imagine missing person cases as sad, messy, and tragic. Maybe a wallet left behind, a phone that stopped answering, a family waiting by the window. But the cases I solved were never supposed to be solved at all. Every one of them had something wrong with it. Something hidden, something that should have stayed buried. In 2 years, I solved 37 missing person cases, and by the end of it, I was convinced that every single one of those people had vanished for a reason that had nothing to do with chance. It started with a woman named Clara Voss. She disappeared on a rainy Thursday in late October, leaving her car parked outside a grocery store with the engine still warm and a bag of oranges on the passenger seat. Her husband said she had only run in for milk. 10 minutes, maybe 15. The store cameras showed her entering through the front doors. They never showed her coming out. The police treated it like a routine disappearance at first. Runaway, domestic trouble, mental health issue. You know the drill. A few flyers, a few interviews. Then the case went cold, like they all do. I wasn't a cop. I wasn't even supposed to be involved. I was working private investigations then, the kind of work that mostly means cheating spouses, stolen jewelry, and finding people who don't want to be found. Clara's sister hired me because she was desperate and because the official answers had already started to sound lazy. There was something in the sister's voice I couldn't ignore, not just grief, fear. She told me Clara had called her the night before she vanished and said, "If I go missing, don't let them say I was confused. Don't let them say I left on my own." That line stuck in my head. I went through the usual steps. Interviewed family, checked bank activity, retraced her route, requested footage, looked at phone records. Nothing made sense. Clara had no secret lover, no major debt, no obvious enemies. She'd been a school librarian for 12 years, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and lived a life so careful it almost looked rehearsed. Then I noticed something small. Her grocery receipt. She had bought exactly 6 items: milk, bread, apples, detergent, batteries, and a pack of black gloves. But her sister swore Clara hated wearing gloves, said they made her feel trapped. So why buy them now? And why black ones, in October, when no one else in that town would care about their color? I found the answer in a storage shed behind her house. It was a narrow little building packed with holiday decorations, old paint cans, and broken lawn tools. At the very back, behind a stack of cardboard boxes, I found a small tin locked with a rusted clasp. Inside were 31 photographs. All of them were of missing people. Some were children, some were elderly, some were young women, men, even a teenage boy. The strange thing was that the photos had all been taken before each person disappeared, but none of them had known they were being watched. There were shots of them in parking lots, at train stations, outside convenience stores, walking dogs, sitting on benches. Every image looked casual, but they had clearly been captured by someone who knew exactly where they would be. On the back of one photo was a note written in cramped blue ink. "She knows." I stared at that note for a long time before I understood that Clara had not been the victim. She had been looking. The next thing I did was trace the photos. That led me to an old man living 3 counties away in a town so small it barely existed on the map. He was a retired surveyor named Edwin Bale, with a house full of maps and a front porch that leaned like it was tired of holding itself up. He denied everything at first, but when I laid the photos on his table, his face changed in a way I'll never forget. Not guilt, not fear, recognition. He said, "You shouldn't have come here." I asked him who had taken the photos. He looked past me, toward the hallway, and whispered, "Not who, what." That was my first real warning. Edwin told me there were places people disappeared more often than anywhere else. Not because of crime, not because of predators, but because of the land itself. Roads that looped wrong. Fields that made compasses spin. Creek beds where sound didn't travel right. He said some places felt like the world had a seam in it, and if you stood in the wrong spot long enough, something would notice you. I should have walked out. Instead, I kept asking questions. Edwin finally showed me a hand-drawn map, marked with red circles, 37 of them. Some were current missing persons cases, some dated back decades. One of the circles was drawn around the grocery store where Clara vanished. Every location had the same note beside it. Thin place, He explained that the missing people were not taken in the ordinary sense. Some got lost, some wandered out of sight, some were lured. But whatever happened, it always happened near a thin place, and the people who investigated too closely tended to go missing themselves. I asked him why he was telling me this. He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Because she sent you." He meant Clara. He told me Clara had come to him 2 weeks before she disappeared, carrying a stack of newspaper clippings and photographs. She had already connected the cases. She had already noticed the pattern, and she had asked him the same question I was asking now. What ties them together? Edwin didn't answer her directly. He gave her the map instead. Then she disappeared. At that point, I still didn't believe in any of it. Not the thin places, not the land remembering, not the idea that the missing were being pulled somewhere by something unseen. I thought Edwin was grieving, half crazy, and scared enough to wrap his fear in folklore. Then I found the basement. It was under Clara's house, hidden behind a false wall in the laundry room. There was no sign of it on any plans. The air coming up from the stairwell was cold and wet, like it had been waiting underground for years. I went down with a flashlight and found the walls lined with names scratched into the concrete, dozens of them. Some names belonged to people who had been missing for years. Some had already been found. A few were crossed out. Some were written over and over again, as if whoever carved them had been trying to keep them from being taken twice. At the far end of the basement was a small room with a chair, a table, and a wall covered in pins and thread. Photo after photo after photo. Clara had been building a case far bigger than I understood. She had maps, dates, weather logs, local deaths, old legends, property records, and interview notes. She had traced all 37 disappearances back through the same locations, the same roads, the same 4-mile stretch of county land, and on the table sat her record. The battery was nearly dead, but I pressed play. Clara's voice came through in a whisper. "If you're hearing this," she said, "then I was right too late." She spoke fast after that, but clearly. She said she'd found a pattern in the disappearances that no one wanted to see. The cases clustered around abandoned crossings, old drainage tunnels, and places where a road had been rebuilt over something older. Every victim had some connection to those places, even if they didn't know it. One had worked road maintenance. One had inherited land nearby. One had survived a childhood flood. One had seen something in the woods and never told anyone. Then she said the line that changed everything. "They aren't all taken, some are chosen." The recorder crackled. Then her breathing changed. She said she had gone to one of the thin places at dusk to see what happened. She had left her car on purpose, alone and unlocked, with the keys inside. She wanted to see whether something would follow her. She said she thought she heard footsteps behind her, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Only the feeling that she was being watched from very close by. Then she said something else. I think Edwin lied. I froze. She explained that the map he gave her was real, but incomplete. There were more places than he admitted, more disappearances, and one name circled in black ink that had not been there before she met him. His. She said she went back to confront him, but he was gone. His house empty, his maps missing, his porch light still on. Her final words were barely audible. "If I don't come back, don't trust the ones who help you find the answers." After that, the tape ended. I sat in that basement for a long time, staring at the recorder, with the feeling that something had just moved upstairs. I didn't go upstairs right away. Instead, I checked the walls again and found something I had missed. In one corner, hidden beneath a shelf, someone had written a sentence directly into the concrete. "You are already counted." I left the house without turning on any lights. By then, I was done pretending this was a normal case. I called in every favor I had, spoke to old contacts, dug through archived reports, and started working the 37 disappearances one by one. The pattern was real. It stretched back almost 50 years. Every few years, another cluster. A child, a drifter, a teacher, a hunter, a bus driver. Each one vanished near the same kind of place, and every investigation either stalled or got buried. But the deeper I looked, the worse it became. People were lying. Officials, families, witnesses. even some of the later found victims. Yes, found, because a few of the missing did come back, not all at once, and not always intact. Some returned confused, some returned with gaps in memory. One came back after 11 days and wouldn't stop staring at windows. One came back after 11 days and wouldn't stop staring at windows. Another was found 3 states away, barefoot, unable to explain how she got there. A teenage boy came home after 4 months and kept drawing the same figure over and over. Tall, narrow, faceless, standing at the edge of a road. The interviews were bad enough. The patterns inside the interviews were worse. Several of the returned people described hearing someone call their names from places that should have been empty. Others remembered walking toward a light that looked like dawn even in the middle of the night. A few said they had followed a voice they trusted, a voice that sounded exactly like a parent, sibling, or friend. And each of them, without fail, had been near one of the thin places. I started sleeping with every light in the house on. Then I got a message from an unknown number. It said, "Stop digging before it notices you." No signature, no follow-up. Just that. I should have ignored it. Instead, I replied with one word. Who? The answer came 10 seconds later. Edwin wasn't the first. I nearly dropped the phone. The next message arrived right after. He was one of the counted. That phrase stayed with me. One of the counted. Counted by what? Counted toward what? I wanted to believe it was a scare tactic, a prank, maybe someone trying to manipulate me. But the timing was too precise. The message came while I was sitting alone in my car outside the county archive. And when I looked up, I saw a man standing across the street, watching me from under the shadow of a dead signpost. He didn't move when I stared back. He simply raised one hand and pointed behind me. I turned around. There was nothing there. When I looked back, the man was gone. I checked the archive security cameras later. The footage showed the street empty. No man, no gesture, no shadow, only me, sitting in the car, suddenly turning my head as if someone had whispered in my ear. That night, I went back to Clara's house. I don't know why. Maybe because I was tired of being afraid in my own skin. Maybe because fear has a way of turning into hunger when you stare at it long enough. The basement was different. That's the only way I can describe it. The air smelled colder. The recorder was gone. The chair had been moved slightly. And on the wall of names, several fresh scratches had appeared since I was last there. One of them was mine. I backed up so fast I hit the stairs. Then I heard someone upstairs. Slow footsteps. Not rushing, not sneaking. Just walking, as if they already knew exactly where I was. I climbed the stairs with my flashlight shaking in my hand and found the hallway empty. But the front door was open, and the rain had started again. Mud was tracked across the floor, leading from the doorway to the kitchen, then stopping dead in the middle of the tiles. As if whoever came in had simply ceased to exist. On the counter sat Clara's grocery bag. Fresh milk, bread, apples, detergent, batteries, and a new pair of black gloves. I didn't touch them. Instead, I looked closer and saw a receipt tucked beneath the bag. It was time-stamped 40 minutes earlier. The store clerk on duty had no memory of selling anything to Clara, but the security footage showed her entering the store, standing at the register, and paying cash. There was just one problem. The woman on the footage wasn't Clara. It was me. After that, things happened fast enough to blur together. I checked motel rooms, changed phones, moved addresses, and stayed away from the county roads. I tried to convince myself I was being set up, that someone had forged the footage, that exhaustion had finally shoved me over the edge. But every answer led to the same place. More disappearances, more records, more thin places. Then I found the oldest case. A boy named Eli Mercer, missing since 1978. His file had been stamped closed because he was never found, but his mother had kept notes in a box under her bed until she died. In those notes, she wrote that Eli used to talk about the people under the road. She thought he meant bullies or drifters, but one page described something else. He had come home one evening with mud on his shoes and said, "They asked me to count the doors." Count the doors. That phrase unlocked everything. I went back through every case and looked for hidden language, repeated details, strange numbers, offhand comments from witnesses. And there it was, buried under years of reports and police shorthand. Doors, windows, crossings, tunnels, thresholds. Every thin place had one thing in common. It was a boundary, a line between one world and another. The missing weren't just disappearing. They were being taken across. Taken where? I don't know. And I don't think I want to know. I wish I could say I walked away then. I wish I could say I burned the files, buried the recordings, and tried to live with ignorance like a sane person would. But by then, I had gone too far. I'd seen too many patterns, heard too many voices in too many empty places, and I had made one mistake I couldn't undo. I had started to recognize the thing in the recordings. Not by name, not by shape, by the way people reacted to it. Whenever someone got too close to the truth, the same thing happened. Their voice would change. Their breathing would stall. They'd forget where they were. They'd look at the corner of a room or the edge of a road, like something had just stepped into view, and then they would vanish, or return wrong, or return changed. The final case wasn't even supposed to be a case. It was me. 3 months ago, I was reported missing by my landlord after failing to pay rent and answering no calls for 11 days. I wasn't gone. I was home, mostly. At least I thought I was. I remember the kettle boiling. I remember standing by the sink. I remember hearing my own name spoken from the hallway in a voice that sounded exactly like my mother's, though she died years ago. I remember opening the door. After that, I lost 11 days. When I came back to myself, I was in my car on a road I didn't know, parked beside a flooded ditch just beyond one of the old county crossings. My boots were covered in mud, my right hand was bleeding, and on the passenger seat was a stack of photos. 38 now. Not 37. 38 missing people. The newest photo was mine. On the back, written in the same cramped blue ink as the first note, were 6 words. Now you know where to look. I still don't know who wrote them. I still don't know whether I solved those cases or simply walked into the shape of them. But I know this much. The missing were never random. The places weren't empty. And whatever waits at the thin places has been patient for a very long time. Because the worst part wasn't learning that 37 people vanished where they shouldn't have. The worst part was realizing that every time I solved one of the cases, something else was learning how I think. And now, whenever a new missing person report comes in, I feel the same cold pressure at the back of my neck. Like the road is watching. Like the dark outside the window is waiting for me to count again. At 4:00 in the afternoon, I stepped into interrogation room C. By the time I walked back out, 3 weeks of my life were gone, even though the wall clock outside still insisted only 20 minutes had passed. That was the first lie the room told me. I remember the corridor more clearly than what happened after, because the hallway felt normal in a way that now seems deeply wrong. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The paint on the walls was scuffed and peeling in the usual places. A bored officer with tired eyes led me down to the end of the hall, past 2 locked doors and a vending machine that hummed like an insect. He told me to take a seat and wait for Detective Holden. I had been brought in because of a missing person case. A college girl named Elise Moore had vanished 3 days earlier after leaving a diner on the edge of town. I'd known her. Not well, but enough for the police to pull me in when they found my name in her call history and a message thread that looked bad out of context. I expected the usual questions, maybe a little pressure, then release. Instead, the detective never came. The room itself was small, windowless, and painfully plain. A camera in the corner with a tiny red light that blinked every few seconds. The air smelled faintly of bleach and something older underneath it, like damp concrete after rain. I sat there trying not to fidget, staring at the scratched tabletop, listening to the building's distant groans. 10 minutes passed, or maybe 15. Time in there already felt slippery. Then I noticed the door was no longer fully closed. It had been shut when I came in. I was certain of that, but now it stood open by maybe an inch, just enough for a line of darkness to cut through the frame. I remember getting up and pushing it wider, expecting to see the hallway. There was no hallway, just a second room. It was almost identical to the one I was in, but not quite. The table was turned the wrong direction. The camera was missing. The walls were darker, as if the paint had soaked up years of smoke, and sitting in the far chair, with his hands folded neatly in front of him, was a man I didn't know. He was dressed like a detective, maybe, in a gray shirt and tie, but his face was wrong in a way I can't explain without sounding insane. Not monstrous, not deformed, just subtly incorrect, like a face copied from memory after the details had started to fade. His smile came a second too late, as if he had to remember how to make it. "You're late," he said. I slammed the door shut so hard the frame rattled. When I spun around, I was still in the original room. The camera blinked red, the air felt colder, and from the vent near the ceiling, I heard what sounded like breathing. I told myself I was stressed, exhausted. Maybe this was some kind of trick by the police, a bad hallucination brought on by the pressure. I sat back down and tried to steady my hands. A minute later, the intercom on the wall crackled to life. "Mr. Vale," said a voice. "Please remain seated." It was not Detective Halden's voice. I had never heard the voice before, but it sounded calm and friendly, almost amused, like a man reading directions he had already memorized. I stood up immediately and pounded on the door, shouting that I wanted a lawyer. The intercom went quiet, then something answered from the other side of the room, a soft tap, then another, then a slow, deliberate scrape, as if fingernails were being dragged across the wall behind me. I backed away so fast that my chair toppled over. The tapping continued, moving in a circle around the room. Left wall, back wall, right wall, ceiling. It wasn't loud, but each sound seemed to come closer than the last, like whatever was making it had learned where I was standing and was taking its time. I should have screamed then. I think I did, though it sounded tiny and useless. The light above me flickered once, twice, then went out. For a few seconds, I was in complete darkness. Then the red blink from the camera returned, brighter than before, and I saw something that made my stomach turn over. The chair opposite me was no longer empty. A person sat there with their head bowed. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. Their hair hung in wet strands over their face. Their wrists were cuffed to the table, but I had no memory of hearing anyone enter. The room smelled suddenly metallic, like old blood. When the figure lifted its head, I stumbled back so hard I hit the wall. It was Elise. At least, it looked like Elise. Her skin was grayish and swollen, as if she had been underwater too long. One eye stared at me, while the other had collapsed inward into a dark bruise of flesh. Her lips moved without sound at first, then finally formed a word. "Don't," she whispered. I rushed to the door, beating on it with both fists. "Open the door! Open it now!" No one answered. Behind me, the chair scraped across the floor. I turned. The thing in the chair was smiling now, but not like a human being smiles. Its jaw had stretched too wide, the lips peeling back from too many sharp, pale teeth. Elise's face was still there, or pieces of it were, but something underneath had started to show through, as if her skin was only borrowed and badly fitted. "Wrong room," it said in Elise's voice. I don't remember deciding to run. I just know that at some point I lunged for the door, and somehow it was open. The hallway beyond looked longer than it should have been, lined with doors that had no numbers. I ran past them all, pounding on one after another, shouting for help. No one answered. The corridor bent left, then right, then seemed to loop back into itself. I saw my own reflection in a glass panel and nearly stopped, because I was standing there in the corridor wearing clothes I didn't recognize. A dark jacket, scuffed shoes, a dried smear of something brown on my sleeve. I was still me, and yet not quite. My face looked thinner, drawn tight as if I hadn't slept in days. Then the overhead lights shut off, one by one behind me, and I heard footsteps, not running, walking, patient, measured footsteps. They came from every direction at once. I shoved through a door at random and found myself in another interrogation room. This one had no table, no chairs, just bare concrete walls and a drain in the floor. There was a sink in one corner, and above it hung a mirror that reflected the room exactly except for the fact that my reflection was already standing there, staring back at me from the other side. It raised one hand and pressed its palm to the glass. I backed away so fast I slipped and hit the floor. The reflection smiled. Then the mirror fogged over from the inside, and words appeared in the condensation, written as though by a finger. Stay until they finish asking. I don't know how long I stayed there. Minutes, hours, maybe longer. Time had stopped behaving like time. Every so often I'd hear a knock from somewhere beyond the walls, followed by the sound of a chair being pulled out. Once I heard my own voice speaking from a nearby room, calm and even, answering questions I had never been asked. Then there was a scream. It was mine. I knew it was mine because I recognized the terror in it. Pure and raw and animal, ripped out of me from some future I hadn't reached yet. That was when the room changed. The drain in the floor began to fill with water, though I could see no source. It rose slowly, black and oily, lapping at my shoes, then my ankles. Something moved beneath the surface. Fingers. Too many fingers. Long and pale and writhing like worms. I kicked backward and struck the wall, and the mirror shattered. At that same instant, every sound in the building stopped. The water vanished. The lights came back on, and I was sitting in interrogation room C again, exactly where I had started, with my hands folded on the table and my heart battering against my ribs. Across from me sat Detective Halden. At least that's what the badge said. He looked tired, older than I remembered from the station hallway, with deep lines around his mouth and a bruise darkening one temple. He slid a paper cup of water toward me and said, very softly, "It took you longer this time." I stared at him, unable to speak. He nodded once, like he had expected that reaction. "You've been in here before, Mr. Vale, more times than you can remember." My throat tightened. "What are you talking about?" "About the room," he said. "About the thing that uses the room. About why we don't leave anyone alone in here." I laughed then, but it came out broken. "You're insane." "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I'm the only one telling you the truth." He reached into his pocket and put a small cassette recorder on the table. "Listen carefully. The version of you that walked in here at 4 o'clock this afternoon is not the first version. Every time the session ends, the room sends something back out. Usually it's close enough to pass." I looked at him, trying to understand, and he kept going. "The clock outside is real. The 20 minutes is real. But time inside the room isn't. It folds, loops. Sometimes it catches. Sometimes it keeps a person long enough for the room to learn them." I wanted to ask what that meant, but he held up one hand. 3 weeks ago, Elise Moore came in here alive. She stayed for 19 minutes. When she came out, it wasn't Elise anymore. Not all of her, anyway. We contained it, or thought we did. Then it started using the room again. We've lost 3 officers, 1 psychiatrist, and now I think we've lost you too. I looked down at my sleeve, at the brown smear I had seen in the corridor. It wasn't brown. It was dried blood. "Why am I still here?" I whispered. Halden's face darkened. "Because it wants you to remember." A cold shock went through me. "Remember what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, and for the first time I noticed that his reflection in the dark window behind him wasn't matching his movements properly. It was smiling when he wasn't. "When you came in here," he said, "you weren't only a witness. You were the last person seen with Elise before she disappeared." "That's impossible." "Is it?" The room seemed to tilt. I suddenly remembered the diner, the rain streaking the windows, Elise laughing at something I'd said, then stopping to look past me with an expression I'd never seen on her face. Fear, recognition, and behind her, in the glass, a shape standing where no one should have been. I covered my mouth. Halden's voice was almost gentle now. "You didn't bring her here, Mr. Vale, but you opened the door." The recorder on the table clicked by itself and began playing. At first there was only static, then breathing, then a voice, shaky and young, my own voice, asking somebody to please stop. Another voice answered from close beside the microphone, so near it sounded like it was inside my ear. Then came the final sentence, spoken in a tone so calm it was worse than a scream. "Interrogation room C is ready." The room went dark again. This time I knew better than to look for the hallway. I kept my eyes on the table as the cold returned, as the chair opposite me scraped across the floor, as something heavy and wet settled into the seat. I heard the slow drip of water, though nothing in the room was wet. I heard someone humming softly, almost kindly, like a parent soothing a child. Then a hand touched mine. It was ice cold and human. I looked up. The face across from me was mine. Not exactly, but close enough to steal my breath. Same eyes, same nose, same scar on the chin from when I was 12 and fell off my bike. But the smile was wider, too wide, and the eyes had that awful, half-finished look I had seen before in the darkness. Something was wearing me the way a man might wear a borrowed coat. "You took your time," it said. I don't remember what happened after that in any clean sequence. There were screams. There was the sound of the door opening and shutting. There was Halden shouting my name. There was a smell like burning paper and wet earth. I remember grabbing the recorder and smashing it against the table. I remember the thing in my face, smiling through teeth that weren't mine. I remember feeling hands on my shoulders, dragging me, and then the violent shock of bright fluorescent light in the corridor. I stumbled out of interrogation room C at 4:20 in the afternoon. The officer at the desk looked up, frowned, and asked why I was covered in blood. When I checked the wall clock, only 20 minutes had passed, but I knew better, because in my pocket was a folded note I had not carried in when I entered. It was written in a handwriting that looked like mine, but older somehow, more certain. "Don't let them question you again." Under that line was one more sentence, pressed so hard the pen had nearly torn the paper. It learns I've pulled over the same car 73 times, and every single time Aurora seems to know exactly what I'm about to say before I even open my mouth. The first time it happened, I thought it was a mistake. A midnight shift has a way of making ordinary things look strange. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the rain was blurring my judgment, but there it was anyway. A rusted sedan parked crooked on the shoulder of Route 19, headlights off, engine dead silent, and a woman sitting behind the wheel like she'd been waiting for me all night. Her name was Aurora. I remember the way she looked at me when I walked up to the driver's side window. She didn't seem startled, annoyed, or even curious. She just gave me a tiny nod, as if I were the one interrupting her routine. I tapped the glass and asked her to lower the window. Before I could say anything else, she said, "I know why you stopped me." That stopped me cold. Most people try to play dumb. Some get defensive. Some reach for their registration before I even ask. Aurora just looked straight ahead, hands resting lightly on the wheel, and spoke in a calm voice that made my skin tighten. I asked for her license and registration. She handed them over without hesitation, but when I glanced at the date of birth on the license, I felt a weird little jolt in my chest. The photo looked recent, yet the eyes in it seemed older than they should have been. Not wrinkled, not anything obvious, just tired in a way that doesn't belong to a driver's license photo. I ran her information through the system. Clean. No warrants, no warnings, no previous encounters. Everything came back normal except for one thing. The plate number didn't match the vehicle on record. I looked back at her and told her she had the wrong plates. Aurora smiled, just barely. "That's not what you're going to tell me," she said. I frowned. "What?" She tilted her head, almost amused. "You're going to tell me to step out of the car." I stared at her for a second too long. The rain ticked against the roof of my cruiser. A truck groaned past in the dark. Then, almost without thinking, I heard myself say the exact words she'd predicted. "Step out of the car." My stomach dropped. She had already unbuckled her seatbelt. That should have been the end of it. A routine stop. An odd woman. A paperwork issue. Maybe a false plate. Maybe some harmless mix-up. But when I checked the back seat, I found something that made my mouth go dry. A child's red rain boot sitting alone on the floorboard, soaked through, with mud caked around the tread like it had been dragged through a ditch. I turned back to ask Aurora whose boot it was. The driver's seat was empty. Not she slipped out while I wasn't looking empty. Not there's a door open and I just missed it empty. I mean completely, impossibly empty. The seat belt was hanging loose. The window was still rolled down. Her license and registration were lying on the seat where she'd left them. I spun around and checked the road. the ditch, the tree line. Nothing. No footsteps. No car doors. No engine starting in the dark. Just the hiss of rain and the low hum of my cruiser. I called it in, and the backup unit arrived in less than 10 minutes. We searched the shoulder, the woods, the ravine beyond the guardrail. No sign of Aurora. No sign of anyone else. The car was still there, engine cold, keys nowhere to be found. Then one of the guys asked me why I was staring at the rear passenger door. I told him I wasn't. He opened it anyway. Inside was another red rain boot, and under it, scratched into the dirty vinyl seat, were 4 words: "You were late again." After that night, I tried to tell myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I'd missed her leaving. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized. Maybe some prankster had planted the boot and the message. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd walked into something that had been waiting for me for a very long time. The second time I saw Aurora, it was 2 weeks later on a county road I didn't usually patrol. Same car, same dent in the rear bumper, same cracked taillight, same woman behind the wheel, looking as if no time had passed at all. This time I wasn't alone. Deputy Klein was riding with me, and I remember the way he laughed when I told him to keep an eye on the driver. "You really think it's the same woman?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. When I stepped out of the cruiser, Aurora lowered her window before I reached her. She said, "You're going to ask why I'm out here." My throat went dry. "Why are you out here?" She smiled again, that small, awful smile, and said, "Because you keep stopping me." Klein came around the back of the patrol car with his hand near his holster, trying to look professional, but I could tell he was uneasy now too. He asked Aurora for ID. She handed it over. I checked the license. Same name, same face, same date of birth, but the issue date was impossible. It had been renewed 3 days after the last stop, which should not have been possible, because the last stop happened after midnight, in the middle of a storm, and I had filed the report myself before sunrise. Klein leaned in and muttered, "That's not right." Aurora heard him. She looked at him, then at me, and said, "It never is." That was when Klein noticed the boot in the back seat. He pulled the door open, and I saw his face drain of color. The little red boot was there again, sitting upright, dry this time, as if it had never been anywhere else. Klein asked Aurora where the child was. Aurora turned her head slowly toward me instead of answering him. "You already asked me that once," she said. My pulse started thudding in my ears. I had no memory of asking her anything like that. Klein stepped back and said we needed to detain her. I agreed. We told her to exit the vehicle. She did, perfectly calm, like this was all part of a conversation she'd had before. The second her feet touched the pavement, all the lights on the road went out. Not just the patrol car, not just the street lamp. The whole stretch of road sank into darkness, so complete it felt like the night had swallowed us. My flashlight flickered twice and died. Klein shouted something beside me, but his voice sounded far away, stretched and thin. Then I heard the back door of the sedan open, slowly, with a long, wet creak. I turned toward the sound, and for one awful second, I saw a small shape in the back seat where no one had been a moment before. A child, maybe, or what was left of one. Pale face, empty eyes, red boot dangling from one foot. Before I could make sense of it, the car door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. Aurora was suddenly behind the wheel again. Klein yelled at her to stop. I remember drawing my weapon, but the barrel felt useless in my hand. Aurora looked directly at me through the rain-streaked glass and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Then the sedan pulled away. It didn't just drive off, it vanished down the road like it had been swallowed by the dark itself. No taillights, no engine noise fading into the distance. Just gone. Klein and I searched for nearly an hour. When power returned, there was no sign of any collision, no tire tracks in the mud, no shattered glass, no car, nothing. Back at the station, I filed the report and left out everything I couldn't explain. I wish I could say that was the last time, but every few months after that, Aurora would appear somewhere else on the county map. Sometimes on a highway under a moonless sky, sometimes at the edge of a flooded field road, once right beside a closed gas station at 3:13 a.m., her engine idling while the rest of the world slept. Each time, it was always the same car, same woman, same calm expression, same sense that she knew my words before I spoke them. And every stop got worse. Sometimes the red boot was in the front seat. Sometimes there were two. Once I found a second pair in the trunk, soaked through and filled with black water that smelled like a pond gone bad. Another time, there was a child's drawing tucked under the wiper blade, a stick-figure police officer standing beside a car, and next to it, a woman with long hair and no face. On the back of the drawing, in a child's handwriting, were 6 words: "He still hasn't found us." After the 5th encounter, I started keeping notes. After the 10th, I stopped sleeping through the day. After the 20th, I began seeing that sedan in places it couldn't have been, reflected in store windows, parked half a block away when I left the diner, idling at the end of my driveway with no one inside. I never told anyone about that last part. People around here already think a night shift deputy is half a step away from losing his mind. I didn't want to give them a reason to believe it, but by the 40th stop, I started noticing patterns. Aurora always appeared near water after heavy rain. She never had a real destination. Her car's interior smelled like wet earth and something sweet and rotten beneath it. And every time I asked her where she was going, she gave the same answer: home. The problem was, I followed the address on her license once. It led to a patch of woods behind an abandoned farmhouse that had burned down years ago. There was no house left, only a scorched foundation, a few collapsed beams, and a single child's shoe half buried in the mud. I picked it up with gloved fingers and turned it over. Inside the heel, written in faded ink, was the name Aurora. That night, I went back to the station and pulled old missing persons files from the archive. I found a report from 20 years ago. A mother and her young daughter vanished during a storm on Route 19. The child's name was never listed in the newspaper clipping, but the mother's name was Aurora Vale. The date of disappearance was the same date as my first stop. I sat there for a long time staring at that file, and the deeper I dug, the worse it got. Other deputies had written strange notes in the margins over the years. One report mentioned a woman in a sedan who appeared familiar in an impossible way. Another claimed the driver knew his childhood nickname. A third was just a torn page with 3 words on it: "Do not answer." By the 73rd stop, I stopped pretending this was a series of coincidences. That night, I found her on the old river road, where the trees close in so tightly the sky looks stitched shut. Same car, same woman, but this time there was something different about her posture. She looked tired, not sleepy, worn down, like she'd been driving forever and had finally reached the edge of wherever she was meant to. I pulled in behind her and walked up with my hand resting on my flashlight. Aurora rolled down the window before I touched it. She said, "You took longer than usual." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" For the first time, she didn't answer immediately. The rain tapped softly on the roof. Somewhere in the dark, water moved over rocks in the river below. Then she said, "You already know." I shook my head. "I know the name on the license. I know what happened 20 years ago. I know something isn't right. But I don't know what you are." Her gaze shifted past me, toward the darkness behind my cruiser. "Then you still haven't found the child," she said. I turned around so fast I nearly slipped in the mud. At first I saw nothing, just the black road, the guardrail, the trees bending in the wind. Then I heard it, a small sound, like someone trying not to cry. It was coming from the trunk of Aurora's car. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was not a body, not a weapon, not anything I expected. It was a little boy, maybe 8 years old, soaked to the skin, shivering violently, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. He looked real, completely real, and yet there was something wrong with him too, something I couldn't name at first. His shadow didn't match his body. It stretched toward the wrong side of the trunk, as if another light source I couldn't see was pulling it away. He clutched a red rain boot to his chest. When I looked back up, Aurora was gone. No sound, no tire tracks, no engine, just the open road and the child in the trunk, crying silently now like he'd forgotten how to make noise. I got him out and called for an ambulance, but when the paramedics arrived, The boy was gone. Not missing from the road, gone from the world. The trunk was empty except for the boot and a thin layer of muddy water. I never stopped looking after that. I read every report, chased every rumor, and followed every lead into every swamp, ravine, and dead-end road in the county. People began whispering that I'd become obsessed. Maybe I had, but I knew what I had seen. I knew the pattern was real. I knew Aurora was tied to whatever took that child. And I knew, somehow, that I was part of it too. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same thing. A rain-slick road, a child's hand reaching for me from the dark, and Aurora sitting calmly in the driver's seat, watching me as if she were waiting for me to remember. Last week, I got a final call from dispatch. Vehicle matching the description. Same route, same plate. I drove out alone. When I found the sedan, it was stopped in the middle of the road with all 4 doors open. Aurora was standing beside it, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at me with that strange, knowing calm. She looked afraid, really afraid. The back seat was empty. The front seat was empty. The trunk was open. No boots, no child. Just wet upholstery and that same sour smell hanging in the air. Aurora said, "You shouldn't have come alone." I asked her what she meant. She pointed past me, toward the woods. At first I thought I saw movement there, just beyond the tree line. A shape, small, patient, watching. Then I heard a voice behind me. My voice. It said, "You're going to ask me to step out of the car." I turned slowly. There, in the driver's seat of my patrol car, sat a man who looked exactly like me, and he was smiling like he'd been waiting for 73 stops to finally come to this. The basement beneath the station doesn't appear on any blueprint, and I know that because I went through every archive I could find after I discovered what they were hiding below the floor. It started with a sound I couldn't ignore. I had been working the late shift at the station for almost 3 years, and by then I knew every groan in the building, every rattle in the pipes, every old complaint the walls liked to make after midnight. I heard something different. It wasn't a pipe clanging or the distant drag of maintenance equipment. It was softer than that. A slow, scraping thud from somewhere under the platform, as if something heavy had shifted in the dark and then settled again. At first, I thought it was one of the cleaners. Then I remembered there was no cleaning crew scheduled. I followed the sound toward the service corridor near the far end of the station, where the lights always seemed a little dimmer than everywhere else. There was a maintenance door there, the kind you barely notice unless you have a reason to look. I'd passed it 1,000 times. That night, though, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Fresh dust marks on the floor. Not footprints exactly. More like something had been dragged out from behind the door and then pulled back in. I called out, got no answer, and tried the handle. Locked. The noise below stopped the moment my hand touched the metal. That should have been enough to make me walk away. Instead, it made me curious in the worst possible way. I went to the station office, got the master key from the lockbox, and came back with my pulse hammering in my ears. The lock opened with a dull click. Behind the door was a narrow stairwell heading down into blackness, so complete it seemed to swallow the beam from my phone. There was no basement listed in any station map I'd ever seen, but the stairs were real. Old concrete, damp walls, rust along the rail. The smell hit me halfway down, wet stone, stagnant water, and something rotten underneath it all. Something that made my stomach turn before I even understood why. At the bottom was a landing and a second door. This one reinforced with metal bands and secured by a chain that looked newer than the rest of the place. It had a padlock big enough to belong on a warehouse gate, not an ordinary station utility room. There was no sign on it. No warning label, nothing. Just cold metal and a scratch pattern around the lock, like someone had tried to open it 100 times before finally giving up. I should have turned around then. Instead, I found a bolt cutter in the maintenance closet upstairs and came back. The chain gave way with a sharp crack that echoed all the way up the stairwell. The room beyond wasn't a basement in any normal sense. It was too large, stretching much farther than the station above it should have allowed. The ceiling was low and arched, lined with old pipes and flickering bulbs that made the shadows. Along the wall stood rows of metal shelving, most of it covered in tarps gone gray with dust. In the center of the room were several long tables, and on them were objects I still have trouble describing without feeling sick. There were suitcases opened and emptied, their contents sorted into neat little piles. Wallets, watches, children's shoes, a wedding ring tied to a thread, dozens of ID cards, faded train passes, hairbrushes, a blood-stained scarf. It looked like a lost and found room at first glance, if a lost and found room had been assembled by someone who didn't understand the difference between personal belongings and evidence. Then I saw the shelves at the far end. They weren't for storage, they were for people, not living people. Files, maybe, if you want to tell yourself that. But each shelf held a narrow metal drawer with a name tag screwed to the front. Some tags were worn to the point of being unreadable, others were fresh, the letters still sharp under the buzzing light. A few drawers were slightly open. I made the mistake of looking inside one. There was no body, just a bundle of hair wrapped in cloth, a train ticket from 17 years ago, and a small plastic toy, the kind you'd find in a vending machine. The toy was cracked down the middle, and someone had written a number on its underside in black ink. I was still staring at it when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, not approaching in a hurry. Whoever it was knew I had already found the room. I turned around and saw a man standing in the doorway I had come through. He was wearing a station uniform, but not one I recognized. His jacket was too old-fashioned, dark navy with brass buttons, and his face looked tired in a way I can only describe as being worn down by years rather than age. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You weren't supposed to come down here," he said. I asked him what this place was. He looked past me at the tables, then at the open drawer in my hands, and for a moment his expression changed into something almost like regret. "When a person disappears in this station," he said, "sometimes they don't go far enough to be gone." I asked if he was joking. He didn't answer that. Instead, he stepped around me and closed the drawer with a quiet, careful motion, as if he were putting a child to sleep. Then he told me to leave before the lights went out. That was the first time I noticed the humming. It had been there the whole time, deep inside the walls, faint but steady, like machinery far below us had just woken up and was trying to remember how to breathe. As he spoke, the sound grew louder, and the bulbs overhead flickered in uneven bursts. The room seemed to tighten around us. The air turned colder. The tarps over the shelves shifted even though there was no wind. I should have run. I didn't. I asked him who he was. He hesitated before answering. And when he did, he said, "The last man who was asked to keep it quiet." Then he walked past me and disappeared into a side corridor I hadn't noticed before, one that looked like it had been cut into the stone after the station was built. I remember following him for a few steps, and then stopping because I realized the corridor was impossible. It slanted downward at an angle that shouldn't have fit beneath the tracks, and the walls were lined with old tiles that didn't match any part of the station above. At the end of it was a room with a single desk and a telephone from a different century. The handset was off the hook, and from somewhere inside the receiver, I heard breathing. I froze so hard I could feel my own heartbeat in my throat. The breathing was slow, wet, and uneven, like something on the other end was very close to the mouthpiece, but too weak or too damaged to speak. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl, a woman's voice, whispering my name. I dropped the phone and stumbled backward. The man in the old uniform was gone. I don't remember how I got back to the stairs, only that I did. I remember slamming the door behind me and wrenching the chain back into place with shaking hands, as if a piece of metal could keep whatever was down there from coming after me. By the time I reached the top, I was sweating through my shirt and my knees were buckling. I told myself I'd report it in the morning. I didn't. The next day, I searched the station records, then the municipal archives, then the city planning office. There was nothing. No basement, no extra corridor, no sealed room, no maintenance annex. The oldest blueprint I found showed the station's foundations ending exactly where the platform began. I even checked the paperwork from the original construction crew. The basement wasn't missing from the records. It had never been there at all, except I knew it had, because I had touched the door, I had seen the shelves, and I had heard my name spoken from a dead phone line. I went back that night with a flashlight, desperate to prove I hadn't lost my mind. The maintenance door was locked again. Not just closed. Locked from the outside, with a fresh chain and a new padlock. The floor around it was spotless, as if no one had opened it in years. But when I pressed my ear against the wood, I heard the same low hum from beneath the station. And underneath that, faint but unmistakably, I heard the soft scrape of something moving in the dark. I tried to find the old uniformed man after that. I checked employee lists, pension records, union photos, everything. No one at the station knew him. No one in the city had ever heard of him. Yet I found a name on one of the metal drawers in the hidden room. A name I'd seen with my own eyes before I ran. Mine. Ever since then, the station has felt different. Some nights, the air in certain hallways turns cold enough to fog my breath. Sometimes I catch the smell of wet concrete where there shouldn't be any moisture at all. And every so often, just before the last train passes through, I hear footsteps beneath the floorboards, pacing slowly, as if someone down there is waiting for the right moment to be let out. I stopped telling people what I found because they either laughed or went quiet in that careful way people do when they think you're losing your grip. But I know what I saw. I know the basement is real, even if every official record says otherwise. And I know something else now, too. The names on those drawers aren't the missing. They're the ones who were kept. And if my name is already down there, filed away in a room that shouldn't exist, then I don't think it was ever meant to stay empty for long.